In a small restaurant in San Francisco, in mid-2012, a young South African management consultant named Katlego Mafai was sitting across from a friend at a corner table. When the meal was over and the bill arrived, the friend did not pull out cash. He did not hand over a card to be run on a countertop terminal. He tapped his card into a small white dongle, no bigger than a coin, plugged into the top of the waiter's Android phone. The transaction took roughly 6 seconds. The receipt was emailed. The waiter walked back to the kitchen. Katlego sat at the table and later, across the following decade, described that meal as the moment his career changed direction. At that time, in South Africa, roughly 70% of adults carried a bank card, but fewer than 7% of small merchants could accept one. That gap, the thing Katlego had just watched a company called Square solve on the other side of the Atlantic, was, in his own country, still unaddressed by the 4 large South African banks that had run the card acquiring industry for the better part of 2 decades. This is the story of the company Katlego went home and built to close that gap. It is called Yoco. And in mid-2026, roughly 14 years after that meal in San Francisco, Yoco is the payments partner for more than 200,000 South African small businesses, processes more than $1 billion in card payments every year, and is in the middle of the most consequential leadership transition in its 11-year history. Hi again, welcome back to the pod. My name is Farouk, and today we are going deep into the story of Yoco. 4 young Africans, none of whom had ever worked inside a bank, walked into Johannesburg in 2013, spent a year writing a 100-page proposal, competed against roughly 15 other teams for the same license, won it, and built the default payments partner for the South African small merchant. This is the story of how they did it, how they nearly ran out of cash before it worked, and how, in the last 12 months, the founder they built the company around finally stepped back. Let's get into it. The story of Yoco does not begin in Cape Town, and it does not begin in Johannesburg either. It begins in 3 separate places on 3 separate continents over roughly 2 decades. The first place is a Johannesburg after-school care center in the late 1980s. 2 boys, roughly 6 or 7 years old, are sitting side by side at the same table. Their names are Katlego Mafai and Lungisa Machoba. They will lose touch as their families move. They will not see each other again for another 16 years when they arrive at the University of Cape Town as freshmen. The second place is a Delta Partners telecoms consulting project in the late 2000s. Delta Partners is a specialist advisory firm focused on telecoms in emerging markets. Its offices are in Dubai, and its client work spans West Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Africa. On a specific mobile operator project in that period, Katlego, now a Delta consultant, meets a Lebanese analyst named Carl Wazan. Carl has grown up between London and Beirut, finished a business degree at the American University of Beirut at 19, and moved to Dubai to do investment banking at Citigroup before joining Delta. He and Katlego work on the same file for months. The third place is a Rocket Internet office in Lagos in 2012. Rocket Internet is the German startup factory that clones proven Silicon Valley business models into emerging markets. In Lagos that year, Rocket is standing up Jumia, its e-commerce play for Africa, and on the Jumia founding team, in 2 positions, are Katlego Mafai and a South African actuary named Bradley Watrous. Bradley has just finished 2 years at Monitor Group. He is being asked to build the finance function of a company that does not yet exist in a country he has not yet lived in. He does it. And when the founding rush of Jumia settles and Katlego steps away from Rocket to think about what he actually wants to build, one of the first phone calls he makes is to Bradley. So, in 2013, in Johannesburg, the 4 converge. Katlego from the Rocket Internet chapter that has just ended. Bradley from Lagos. Lungisa from Cape Town, where he has just wound down a smartphone-based VoIP company called Yoco Communications. And Carl from Delta Partners in Dubai. 4 men. Complementary skills. Shared chemistry built from earlier chapters, one relationship at a time, and, notably, no fixed idea about what the company should be. The idea comes from Katlego. From the 20 minutes he had spent, roughly a year earlier, sitting in front of a Square reader in San Francisco, the thesis they wrote down was simple. In South Africa, 27 million adults held a bank card, roughly 70% of the adult population. But of the country's small merchants, fewer than 7% could accept one. The 4 large South African banks, Standard Bank, Absa, First National Bank, and Nedbank, controlled the card acquiring market. Their point-of-sale terminals required extended banking history, multi-year contracts, monthly rental, and paperwork that most small merchants could not clear. The demand existed. The infrastructure did not reach it. The thesis Katlego framed to his co-founders was, in his own words later, "All we really did was take the prepaid phone analogy and apply it to payments. No contracts, no monthly fees. Buy the device, plug it in, transact." The problem was that the thesis needed a sponsor bank. In South Africa, in 2013, a company like Yoco could not obtain its own acquiring license. It needed a bank willing to share its license and take the compliance risk of onboarding thousands of small merchants under a shared master account. That was the specific moment the global Visa and MasterCard payment facilitator framework had opened up. It was the door that had let Square, iZettle, and SumUp exist in their own home markets. The four Yoco founders spent close to a year in Johannesburg negotiating with South African banks for a sponsor arrangement. They wrote a 100-page proposal. They were competing on the public record against roughly 15 other South African teams pitching the same play. They were four men in their late 20s and early 30s, and they had, between them, zero banking industry experience. The bank eventually told them their outsider status was an asset, no legacy assumptions. They won the bank. The specific bank Yoco secured its sponsor arrangement with has never been publicly named, a fact worth pausing on because that invisible partner is the reason everything that follows was possible. What is on the record is that Yoco closed the sponsor bank agreement and, in parallel, closed their first institutional capital. Their earliest investor was CRE Venture Capital, an Africa-focused firm out of Johannesburg. Angel investors, including Robbie Hilkowitz and Greg Kidd of Hard Yakka, followed. The initial capital was small, roughly $2.4 million raised across a pre-seed and a seed round between 2014 and mid-2015. In October 2014, in Cape Town, Yoco ran its first live card transaction, a pilot. A merchant, a customer, a small blue Bluetooth reader plugged into a phone, and a card swipe that cleared through a real acquiring rail. The company launched publicly in 2015. The early merchants were the exact profile the thesis had predicted. Hair salons, independent cafes, restaurants without the Speedpoint contract, fitness studios, tradespeople running invoices for site work, small tourism operators, independent bookstores. None of them had the kind of banking history the big four banks required for a card machine. All of them had customers who carried cards. Yoco cleared the barrier by removing the lock-in. There was no contract. There was no monthly rental. You bought the device from a retail partner. You linked it to the app. You started transacting. If it did not work for your business, you stopped, and the bank did not chase you. The launch worked. The business grew. And quietly, the company almost died. In March 2018, at a Cape Town event where founders speak publicly about what has gone wrong, Katlego Mapai took the stage and disclosed something that Yoco had not, at the time, made public. There was a period in the company's early history where Yoco averaged roughly 60 days of working capital between funding rounds. At one point, he told the room, the company was down to about 1 month of cash before the next round closed. There was no dramatic public announcement of that moment when it happened. The company kept operating. The next round of capital arrived, but the moment was real. It was the moment where every early-stage payments company either dies or does not, and Yoco, on his own account, was on the wrong side of that line before the round closed and the trajectory shifted. The other struggle of that early period was technical. By late 2017, Yoco's merchant count had crossed 17,000, and the code base written to serve the first 1,000 merchants was no longer fit to serve the 17,000th. Lungisa Machoba, as Chief Technology Officer, made the call to fully rewrite the point-of-sale software stack in React Native. It was a significant investment of engineering time in a company where every month of runway was still being counted, but the alternative was carrying a code base into the next scale phase that would break under load. The rewrite went in. The company crossed the technical inflection. In October 2018, Yoco launched a second product on top of the payments layer. It was called Yoco Capital, and it was, at the time, the single most important strategic move the company had made since founding. Yoco Capital was a cash advance product for merchants. Not a loan, not a credit line, not a traditional bank overdraft. An upfront payment to the merchant, repaid as a fixed percentage of the merchant's future daily card sales, with no fixed monthly installment, no penalties, and no collateral. The underwriting model was the specific innovation. Because Yoco was already processing every card transaction the merchant made, Yoco could see the daily revenue of the business in real time. It did not need a credit bureau file. It did not need audited financial statements. It did not need 6 months of bank statements. It had the daily card sales history of the merchant. That was enough. The pilot cohort was 225 merchants. The total advanced was 7.5 million rand. The default rate, disclosed a year later, was roughly 2%, a remarkable number in a market where consumer unsecured lending default rates run into the double digits because the repayment was structurally tied to the very transactions the merchant was already running through Yoco. Then, in March 2020, the world stopped. The South African government moved to level 5 lockdown. Restaurants closed. Retailers closed, salons closed. Yoco's merchants, most of them small independent operators without a capital buffer, saw their card revenue drop, in some cases, by more than 90% overnight. In late April 2020, roughly a month into lockdown, Yoco became one of the first high-profile South African technology startups to publicly announce that it was reducing headcount and cutting leadership salaries. It was a hard call, made publicly at a moment where publicity around it was the last thing any founder wanted. It was also, in retrospect, the call that let the company survive to the next chapter. 6 months later, in October 2020, on the company's 5th anniversary, Yoco launched the Yoco Neo. It was the company's first fully standalone card machine. Not a Bluetooth dongle plugged into a phone. A full touchscreen device with its own built-in SIM card and unlimited data and roaming. It cleared the specific objection that had been holding back the segment of merchants who did not want to run their business off a phone. And it launched precisely as the pandemic was accelerating the adoption of cashless payments across South African retail. Between March and July 2020, Yoco's own disclosure was that the number of small merchants using cashless payments through its platform had grown by 300%. On the 27th of July 2021, Yoco announced the largest single round in its history. $83 million in Series C funding, led by Dragoneer Investment Group, the same San Francisco-based crossover firm behind Chime, Klarna, Nubank, and, notably, Square. Behind Dragoneer, the round included Briar Capital, HOF Capital, the Raba Partnership, and follow-on capital from Partech, Velocity, Orange Ventures, and Quona. Angels on the cap table included operators from Coinbase, Revolut, Spotify, and Gojek. At the time of the round, Yoco had roughly 150,000 merchants, was adding 500 new ones a day, was already processing more than $1 billion in card payments annually, and was, by a distance, the largest independent card acquirer for South African small businesses. The $83 million was earmarked for 3 things. The first was expansion of the retail distribution footprint, and by October of that year, Yoco card readers were sitting on the shelves of Builders Warehouse, Macro, Hi-Fi Corp, Incredible Connection, Cellucity, and the iStore. The second was hardware. That October, Yoco launched the Yoco Kumo, a South African-designed, Chinese-manufactured, locally assembled second-generation card machine. The third was talent. Yoco opened an office in Amsterdam to hire product and engineering talent that was hard to source in South Africa and, over the next 3 years, cycled through 3 tuck-in acquisitions, Kobe Interactive in 2019, Dado in 2021, and Nona Digital in 2022, the last of which pushed the company's total headcount past 500. Between 2023 and 2026, Yoco crossed a series of adjacent milestones. In October 2023, Yoco Capital passed 2 billion rand cumulatively disbursed to more than 50,000 South African merchants. In December that year, Yoco formalized a partnership with the Taiwanese chip designer MediaTek, whose Internet of Things chipsets now power the Yoco Neo Touch. And on the 12th of May 2026, Yoco became one of Apple's first 2 South African launch partners for Tap to Pay on iPhone. The specific feature that turns any iPhone from the XS model or newer into a contactless card acceptance terminal. No dongle, no reader. The iPhone itself becomes the point of sale. By mid-2026, Yoco processes more than $1 billion in card payments annually, roughly 30 million individual card taps a year, across more than 200,000 South African small businesses. Yoco Capital has, cumulatively, disbursed more than 3 billion rand, and on external estimates, the company is valued at around $700 million. Not yet a unicorn. Widely described in the South African fintech press as a soonicorn. In September 2025, after 10 years as chief executive, Katlego Mathai stepped back from operational leadership of the company he had founded. In his place, on an interim basis, the board named two of the three remaining co-founders, Bradley Watrous and Lungisa Matshoba, as interim co-chief executives. Katlego remained on as founder and chairman with a focus on strategy. In every interview across the next several months, he described the decision as a deliberate handover. A recognition that the company was moving into a phase that required a different kind of leader. That leader arrived on the 1st of June 2026. His name is Carsten Holtkameier. He is German. He is Yoco's first non-founder chief executive in the company's 11-year history. His prior job was chief executive of Solaris, the Berlin embedded finance and banking as a service group. Before that, he spent roughly a decade as market chief executive of Barclaycard Germany. His hiring was framed publicly as the beginning of the phase in which Yoco prepares for a public listing. Bradley Watrous returned to the chief financial officer role. Lungisa Matshoba became chief product and technology officer. Carl Wazen stayed on as chief business officer. 3 weeks before Carsten's start date, on the 28th of May 2026, Yoco announced its first publicly disclosed strategic AI acquisition. A South African startup called Dyna, founded by two former Discovery Group actuaries, Thalentha Ngobeni and Chris Du Plessis, and an engineer named David Young. Dyna had built an AI-native operating system for restaurants and independent businesses. Its embedded assistant could answer merchant questions in real time. Why are stock levels inconsistent? Why did profits decline? What is unusual about today's sales? The strategic framing from Yoco's side was clear. Yoco was no longer a card reader company. Yoco was becoming, in its own language, a smart commerce platform. Payments, point of sale, working capital, savings, loyalty, and, now, AI-driven business intelligence, all in one merchant graph. At the Yoco Next 2026 event in June, the company unveiled the shape of that platform in detail. Transaction fees cut by up to 40%. 250 million rand a year reinvested into South African small businesses, a yield of 4% on the new Yoco savings product, which 4,000 merchants adopted in the first 21 days after launch. Card-linked loyalty, industry modes for food, retail, and beauty. A third-party developer platform called Yoco Connect. All of it stacked on top of the same acquiring rails Yoco had spent a decade building. The pressure Yoco is walking into is real. Its closest South African competitor, iCoca, was acquired by Nedbank for roughly 94 million United States dollars and is now a wholly owned subsidiary of one of the four incumbent South African banks Yoco was originally set up to root around. Capitec Pay is undercutting on price. Nedbank Pocket POS is undercutting on distribution, and, in 2026, a new South African payment service provider licensing regime is expected to arrive that will, for the first time, let Yoco become a licensed acquirer in its own right without a sponsor bank, and at the same time let a wave of new fintech entrants do the same. The tailwind and the headwind are the same regulatory event. In 2012, in a small restaurant in San Francisco, a young South African consultant watched a friend pay a bill by tapping a card into a small white dongle. 2 years later, in October 2014, in Cape Town, that consultant and his 3 co-founders ran their first live card transaction on a company they had spent almost a year fighting to license. 12 years later, in mid-2026, Yoco is the payments partner for more than 200,000 South African small businesses, has just handed the top job to its first non-founder chief executive, and has just made the first strategic AI acquisition in its 11-year history. This is Asili Africa. Every empire has an origin. That is the story. And like every story worth telling, this one is still being written. If this episode made you see something differently, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I am Farouk. This is Asili Africa. Every empire has an origin. Now you know this one. So, start building, because yours might be tomorrow's origin story. See you on the next one.